New York, London, Tokyo, the world's most extravagant cities, each a melting pot of commerce, culture, and entertainment. Every year, more than 100 million visitors walk beneath their towering monoliths, monuments to mankind's perseverance and ingenuity. But no visitor on any shore has made a more lasting impression than the giant monsters that have come before. Never content with ravaging small towns, these 200-ton tourists have been seeing and smashing the sights since the silent film era. The Brontosaurus in The Lost World, the eighth wonder of the world, King Kong, the Paleosaurus in The Giant Behemoth, the Rhedosaurus in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and the gargantuan Godzilla. However, no visitor from the past could prepare mankind for the night when London was host to the biggest, baddest mother of them all. As with Gorgo's trek from the caverns of the deep oceans to London's Battersea Funfair, the film's transition from conception to completion was a tortuous journey. But like all great screen adventures, Gorgo's history starts with its cinematic storyteller.
He was a brilliant designer, wonderful designer, Russian-born, and then in the wake of the revolution in 18, left and went to France, and it was essentially just very continental.
He had this spectacular eye and this wonderful way with architecture and with, I think, and Gothic background to stories and things like that.
On most things he's listed as art director, but also production designer and so on. There's often very little difference between a production designer, an art director, and the 4 or 5 other names that we have for essentially somebody who designs a film.
When he came to the United States, he ended up at Universal. He worked on the Sherlock Holmes series. He even did one of the Lon Chaney Jr. Inner Sanctum movies, Strange Confession.
When he was doing the sets for Limelight, which is Chaplin's last Hollywood film, there was some set that he had designed where he sensed a slight uneasiness about Chaplin's reaction to it. Later in the day or the next day, Chaplin said, you know what's wrong? I mean, that wall really needs to be shorter and you know, this hallway needs to be moved back. And within an hour or two, it collapsed. He had built it like an accordion, essentially. He knew that Chaplin was going to change his mind just from the attitude toward it. So they just shortened it. Chaplin says, right, let's go. And that was Lurie, very inventive and very practical.
By 1952, the road had been paved for a new giant monster film.
There had been a lot of giant monster movies, starting out with the re-release of King Kong in the wake of Mighty Joe Young coming out.
Mightier than King Kong, Mighty Joe Young!
And then a couple of years later, the release of King Kong to television, which was extraordinary, and it was highly touted on television.
We're millionaires, boys! I'll share it with all of you! Why, in a few months it'll be up in lights on Broadway! Kong! The eighth wonder of the world!
Which then inspired some independent producers to do Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
Enter nickel-and-dime entrepreneurs Jack Dietz and Hal E. Chester. Dietz made a name for himself, financing the Bela Lugosi and the Bowery Boys features at Monogram. Together, Dietz and former East Side Kid Chester formed their own releasing company. In May of 1952, Dietz ran across 3 properties which he felt had some exploitation value. Dietz approached me and asked me to art direct these 3 films on a very low budget. Of the 3, one of them interested me, the one for the monster.
Impossible, unbelievable, fantastic, but I tell you it could happen.
So he came to giant monsters not with necessarily a background in fantasy. He came to it knowing the tricks that you use to make something good and visual.
Immediately, Laurier worked with a team of writers, including friend Dan Hyatt, to develop Dietz's outline into a workable screenplay, which would ultimately incorporate elements of the short story by author Ray Bradbury, The Foghorn, originally published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1951 as The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The foghorn was supposed to have resembled the mating call of the creature, and it was therefore drawn to it. But the idea did not hold up well with the final script, so we just used it as a tiny episode.
Wreaking his prehistoric fury on modern man and his puny machine.
The monster from beneath the sea would showcase the animation effects of stop-motion magician Ray Harryhausen, his first solo effort following his apprenticeship with the legendary O'Brien on 1949's Oscar-winning Mighty Joe Young.
But primarily it's I think Laurier's call on these things. For example, the plates that they shot, the background images of New York when the monster's supposed to be rampaging. Harryhausen wasn't along when they went to New York, and he was kind of annoyed. It was a low-budget picture, and they didn't have the time or money to send everybody. And Laurier said, I know what to give you. Don't worry about it.
After a complicated post-production phase, Jack Dietz viewed the film and quickly realized that it was too good for the small regional distribution circuit he had in mind. He made an offer to Jack L. Warner, who immediately purchased the film outright. Warner then retitled the film, preferring the more ominous Beast from 20,000 Fathoms of Bradbury's original story. The runaway box office success of Beast gave birth to such offshoots as the nuclear-spawned giant ants of Them in 1954 and Japan's still-running stream of monsters beginning with that year's seminal Godzilla.
And then Laurier knocked off a week's worth of work on Colossus of New York. That was the entire film. It only took a week, 10 days maximum.
Unchecked by any barrier of man or nature, running wild in a terrifying orgy of destruction.
After his own big bug epic of 1957, The Black Scorpion, Willis O'Brien teamed with director Laurier on 1958's The Giant Behemoth, a basic retread of Beast with a change of scene from America to Great Britain, where it was filmed.
It actually started off as something else entirely. It was a science fiction picture with an ecological bent. There's some sort of glowing blob that is this radioactivity caused by industrial waste. And the producers, Allied Artists, they said, well, no, we need a monster to sell this movie. It's a science fiction picture. They have to have monsters. So it became essentially a pastiche of Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
Which is interesting. It comes into town and wrecks the town. It's sort of King Kong again, what do you call it, that type of thing. The big giant monster wrecks the place.
Despite technical and budget problems, the film succeeds as a moderately entertaining and decidedly grim portrayal of radiation-powered devastation. Upon Laurier's return from England, he was approached by the producer brothers Frank and Maurice King to see if he could conjure up yet another sea monster story. But the giant monster Laurier was commissioned to create for the screen would not be the only monsters he would have to contend with.
The King brothers were they were criminals. And not surprisingly, given that background, they ended up in Hollywood. They decided they wanted to make movies.
They had Monogram Pictures as their primary home during the late 30s and early 40s. But their movies were a little cut above the normal Monogram product. When Strangers Marry, directed by William Castle, which was his first film as a director, starring Robert Mitchum and Dean Jagger.
Remember Scarface? Remember Little Caesar? The enormity of their crimes was exceeded in real life by the man you're now looking at.
One of the first biggies they did was a fairly low-budget movie called Dillinger, and it made a pot of money.
Introducing a new dynamic screen personality, Lawrence Tierney as John Dillinger.
They then went on, they did a very good film with Frank Tuttle, who had directed This Gun for Hire at Paramount, called Suspense. So they were kind of the top flight producers at Monogram through the war years.
Through distributors like RKO and United Artists, they released scores of crime dramas, including the critically successful Gun Crazy, directed in 1949 by Joseph H. Lewis.
In the early 1950s, they did a couple of interesting films, and again, competently made, too. Carnival Story with Steve Cochran, which is shot overseas.
After setting their sights on the big top with Carnival Story, they turned to adventure films such as 1956's Oscar-winning The Brave One.
They would get their money independently, and then they would release through a studio.
As the self-appointed Barnum and Bailey of the motion picture business, the King brothers were always on the lookout for the latest cinematic sensation.
So way down the line, late in the 1950s, the King brothers decided it'd be a good idea to make a giant monster movie.
After monitoring the enormous profits Japan's Toho films were generating with films like Godzilla and Saturday Matinees, the King brothers lined up a co-production deal in Japan to produce their own giant monster saga.
The King brothers decided that this was going to be the biggest, the grandest giant monster film of all. And naturally, they went to a guy who had done it at least twice before.
I was commissioned to write the screenplay together with my friend Daniel Hyatt. Our story was entitled Kuru Island, and it took place on one of the Pacific Islands and in Tokyo, Japan.
The genesis of Gorgo and its happy ending, which is fairly extraordinary for giant monster movies, at least it was till then, goes back to Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, when Gene's daughter, Anita, saw the movie.
The child was strangely affected by the climax, in which the beast dies amidst the flames of an amusement park inferno. During the drive home, she blurted out, "You were bad, Daddy. You killed the nice beast."
And her dad said, "Well, one of these days I'll do a movie where the monster doesn't die, just for you."
The story had some very poetic qualities. Although the locale was to him in Japan, it had nothing to do with the Godzilla-type story construction. I wanted the creature to confront human beings, but there were no scenes of the military shooting at it.
Which gives this a neat tone that monster movies didn't have before. Essentially all the things in the 50s, even going back to King Kong and the Lost World, the monsters weren't characters, they were forces of nature. They were there to destroy things and to eat people and to scare people, but they didn't have any particular character.
But when the co-production deal in Japan fell through, the King brothers searched the globe for another locale to base their giant monster story.
So they came up with another idea. Let's shoot it in Paris, and this great monster can wade up the Seine from the sea to Paris and tear down the Eiffel Tower. And Luria, who adored Paris, I mean, he was just this wonderful baby, a Frenchman at heart, basically, pointed out that Paris was 100 miles inland, and the monster would have to wade about a week and a half up this river to get to it. And went, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to work.
By April of 1959, the King brothers' whirlwind tour of Europe came to an end. The decision was made to shoot the picture in London, partly due to the facilities at MGM's studio in Boreham Wood, as well as access to special effects genius Tom Howard, head of the studio's optical house at the time. Along with the change in location, the screenplay underwent a series of extensive revisions, per Frank King's request. 2 new writers were employed to change the story completely. When I asked the King brothers the reasons for this, the answer was, "But Gene, it is to your advantage. As you will direct this film, you will have an enriched screenplay. Believe us, 2 brains are better than 1. Instead of a reverence for nature, the constant theme found within the original Kuru script, the new characters' motivations were that of greed, with the film's heroes transformed from innocent pearl divers to treasure hunters."
Oh, let's get out of here. Wait a minute, Sam. There's thousands of dollars worth of stuff in that old rust bucket. I'm not getting out of here without it.
Also added to the climax of the new script was the violent intervention of the military. However, some of the spectacle found within Lurier's version survived. The volcanic eruption under the sea, the capture of the smaller creature, and the surprising final rescue by its mother.
It was this great story about them finding this dinosaur, and the big screw-up is this giant beast is the baby Gorgo, and here comes Mom to save him.
You're trying to say there may be a fully grown one of these things around somewhere?
It's a fair assumption.
Where there are offspring, there are generally parents.
But it was a great twist because you didn't know it to the very end of the film that Gorgo was not the main character of this film.
I personally think that the mother-baby relationship in the story is what positively influenced the King brothers, known for their strong attachment to their mother. While the script was readapted to take advantage of the English and Irish locales, the title was changed to Gorgo, a contraction of the film's alleged gigantic Gorgosaurus of the prehistoric era. Now, with the revised script and the new locations, the producers turned their attention to the casting of their monster epic.
Hi. Is there a harbour master we can talk to?
How do you enter with an issue?
Gaelic, huh?
Doesn't sound like welcome in any language.
As with his earlier prehistoric monster films, Laurier assembled for Gorgo a cast of solid but lesser-known actors, the exception being the then-prominent British leading man Bill Travers in the role of Sea Captain Joe Ryan. A veteran of film and television, Travers began his acting career on the stage in 1949, but it was his success in the 1955 film Geordie that landed him a contract with MGM. The studio cast Travers in a handful of A-budget features, including Bowani Junction, The Seventh Sin, and The Barretts of Wimpole Street. Travers' change-of-heart decision to free Gorgo from his Battersea Park enclosure near the end of the film was a prelude to future animal rights activist and conservationist roles, including that of the real-life George Adamson in the highly successful 1966 film Born Free.
It's looking terribly ugly. The men are getting edgy. Yeah, so am I.
For the role of Ryan's first officer, the production cast American-born film and television actor William Sylvester. Sylvester moved to England after World War II and developed a successful career in British B-films. Sylvester went on to star in several British horror films, most notably Devil Doll and Devils of Darkness.
This man discovered their secret.
He later made a brief appearance in the James Bond spectacular You Only Live Twice, shortly before playing a leading role in Stanley Kubrick's science fiction landmark 2001, A Space Odyssey.
It's a bad thing you're doing. A terrible bad thing, Mr. Ryan.
Why don't you call me Joe?
Okay, Joe.
Okay, Sean.
Even child actor Vincent Winter, who played the Irish orphan Sean, already had an established career prior to Gorgo.
I came to let you go back to the sea.
His outstanding performance in 1953's The Little Kidnappers had earned him an honorary Oscar. Many familiar British character faces appeared in Gorgo in supporting or bit roles, some without billing. Martin Benson, who played circus manager Dorkin, is best known as gangster Mr. Solo in the James Bond classic Goldfinger.
Everybody in the world is talking about Gorgo, but only you can see him, and only here at Dawkins. Queuing both sides, 5 shillings, ladies and gentlemen.
Harbour Master Christopher Rhodes would have his greatest screen glory the following year as the King's champion defeated in bloody combat by Charlton Heston's heroic El Cid.
And how do you think you're going to dispose of it?
Oh, you must have figured out a way. I'll bet we can.
You dirty blackmailer!
Shut up! You're getting off easy, friend.
Unbilled actors include Alex Scott and Harvey Hall, familiar heavies on British television and in Hammer films, as respectively an angry fisherman and an army officer. Army Commander Martin Boddy is best known as Joan Collins' unsuspecting husband in Amicus Films' 1972 EC Comics adaptation Tales from the Crypt. The distinguished Nigel Green appears for all of 30 seconds as an army officer making a report. He is better known as Hercules in Harryhausen's Jason and the Argonauts. The ghostly-looking television reporter is Maurice Kaufman.
With a British cast in this type of film, they always brought an element of dramatic authority. Sometimes you didn't get that in an American movie of the same type.
Filming at MGM's British studio at Borehamwood meant that Laurier could draw his crew from the top talents in the industry. Art director Elliot Scott's career stretched from such 1950s and 60s favorites as George Powell's Tom Thumb and Robert Wise's The Haunting. The Technicolor cinematography was in the exceedingly capable hands of the veteran Freddie Young, whose long career embraced MGM's Ivanhoe and John Ford's Mogambo, Oscar wins for 3 David Lean epics beginning with Lawrence of Arabia and the 007 blockbuster You Only Live Twice. Technician Tom Howard's pioneering Technicolor optical effects helped earn an Oscar for Alexander Korda's 1940 Thief of Baghdad. His expertise graced most MGM productions, netting Oscars in 1958 for Tom Thumb and 1968 for Stanley Kubrick's massive 2001 A Space Odyssey. The first major item on the agenda at the MGM studio was the creation of the Gorgo suit.
What's that?
That's Ogra, the sea spirit.
As with Laurier's previous prehistoric films, the look of the creature was partly based upon his own designs.
The design of Gorgo was wonderful. It was a really interesting looking dinosaur with those kind of wings behind its ears. So it seemed very lifelike.
Laurier refused to base the design of Gorgo on the original Godzilla suit. He felt that it was clumsy, unconvincing, and incapable of the characterization found within the script. Ultimately, the solution was to devise a series of hydraulically powered commands operated by a control box from within the suit. The movement of the eyes, the ears, and the tail were all activated by independent hydraulic systems.
It's an interesting approach, and I think it works organically within the story. It doesn't seem false for some reason.
4 stuntmen were recruited to become the inner skeleton of the 8-foot Gorgo suit. Each had to practice walking with heavy webbed feet, as well as to learn what buttons to push for each hydraulic function.
It was really a terrific suit. I'm sure extremely uncomfortable.
But there is still that touch, that human element, I think that somehow always comes through with the man in the suit.
Gorgo began production on September 23, 1959, with Morris King handling the administrative duties and his cigar-chomping younger brother, Frank, keeping a close eye on the on-set activities. The size of the MGM studio was a special effects director's dream, quite a contrast to the tiny London studio where Laurier filmed the giant behemoth.
The effects in this are extraordinary. It's a combination of both Laurier's design work and the effects crew at MGM.
Elliot Scott built a very impressive exterior of Dawkins' amusement area, containing the Gorgo compound. Next to it, matching the exterior, was a miniature set scaled to Gorgo's size of the same compound. For the early diving sequences, a deep tank was used on the main stage. 2 shallow water tanks containing 3 feet of water were built on 2 additional sound stages. One was used exclusively for the 200-foot miniature of the Thames River embankment and the Tower Bridge.
The miniature effects are extraordinary, huge things, and because they're big, when they're destroyed, they have a certain heft to them, which you don't have in a lot of Godzilla pictures. It just looks like he's knocking over paper buildings. And certainly in something like Reptilicus, where they really are paper buildings, you really felt this creature was destroying these 100-year-old, 200, 400-year-old London landmarks.
Now, they overcrank the camera. In other words, they film the camera at a very high speed. And what it does is it slows down the action. If you'd see that just in real time, I mean, when they're shooting it, you'd laugh. You really would laugh. Because, I mean, the guy hits the thing and it just literally just falls right down. It has to have weight. And that's the one way you get weight, because it's huge and it's coming down and crashing and stuff. And with your sound effects, you can make it work.
The second stage accommodated the live-action sets for the blue screen shots. The storm sequence at the beginning of the film was filmed on this stage, with dump tanks flooding the deck of the freighter set.
I got you! The scene that really got me in Gorgo and scared me was this one, because also it was a prop. So it seemed like, I was like, oh my God, it seemed like they had actually found a giant dinosaur. It was there under the water, and they just happened to be lucky enough to be there with cameras to actually capture this thing.
For the scenes where we had to first see the drugged animal on the deck of the ship, then transported on a platform truck from the docks to a special enclosure in the amusement area, Battersea Park, London, we used a subterfuge. The entire body was covered by tarp, with only the life-size head and paw props exposed.
And the giant Gorgo prop that they use when he's strapped to the back of the truck and he's going through Piccadilly Circus and his head's moving and everything just seemed completely lifelike to kids.
Laurier planned effects master shots to accommodate traveling mats for baby Gorgo, miniatures for destruction, and a moving split-screen process, allowing the mother to move across the live-action areas. This process was perfected by Tom Howard for George Powell's Tom Thumb.
And this is really where we did get into the big time with automotion. I even sort of thought up the name automotion, which is a bit tame and a bit not very smart.
It was quite tricky to make two different-sized animals appear in the same frame. In the scene of the two monsters making their way to the waterfront among the burning buildings, the master shot was of the mother moving, shot against the smaller-scale miniature set of the waterfront. The baby was shot separately on blue screen, reduced and printed onto the master shot by a traveling matte process.
It was two films in the camera. One was a stock, the raw stock. One was the master, what we call in this country the master. And all the time we were correcting it to make sure, right, we'd have to start again until we got it right so that no one crossed the line. As soon as they got to crossing line, we started our auto motion going. We printed that with all the mattes taken out, as it were.
In the same shot, we added views of panicky running people shot on the studio backlot and fitted exactly into a predetermined place on the frame.
But I'm afraid to say that the whole film was made with not enough money. I don't think there was enough thought put into shooting of some of the miniatures. I think a lot more could have been made out of them. Some of them are beautifully constructed. A lot more could have been made out of them.
In the end, Gorgo was the most costly and time-consuming motion picture the King brothers ever made. Its production overruns reportedly causing more than 30 King brothers projects to be cancelled. Gorgo's total production cost was $650,000, ironically the same cost as the original King Kong, more than 25 years earlier. More and more military action stock shots were added. Depth charges were being dropped, planes crisscrossed the skies, explosives were added. When I expressed my doubts to the King brothers, they assured me that they knew the taste of the audiences better than me. Maybe they knew. The chore of weaving Gorgo's many strands and pleasing its too many cooks fell to the reliable Eric Boyd Perkins. My first general impression confirmed my doubts about the validity of military confrontation. But the picture was alive. Gorgo was alive. Gorgo's hauntingly melodic and bombastically dynamic music score was provided by the classically trained Italian composer Angelo Francesco Lavagnino, who scored some 300 films over a 20-year period. When we returned to Hollywood in December, we could already hear the temporary recording of the theme for Gorgo. It was beautiful. In the end, Gorgo's release was held up for almost 2 years by the British trade union ACTT because of the King brothers' failure to pay their lab bills.
My first introduction to Gorgo was the stunning Basil Gogos painting on issue of Famous Monsters, right when the film was coming out, and I was like, oh my gosh, what in the world is this? And it was the dinosaur epic I think we've all been waiting for.
This was a kids movie, but it had real heart in it.
The whole idea of you're being taken away to the circus, you're being kidnapped, and you're being put on display, and your mom is going to come in there and kill the bad guys and rescue you. I mean, that was just ideal.
Except the destruction shown in the final couple of reels is really nasty.
Creature's gone.
I mean, people are getting burned alive and crushed by debris.
Gorgo was successfully released after long delays to good box office in both the US and the UK, but had its premiere in Tokyo, Japan, of all places, where it was an unexpected smash hit.
Gorgo was very, very heavily promoted when it was released here by MGM. Very heavily promoted.
Gorgo's footprints proved deep indeed, and probably led Toho Films to revive their long-dormant Godzilla. Most blatantly, in 1967, another rival studio, Nikatsu, virtually remade Gorgo in its original South Sea setting as Gappa, about two monster parents looking for their offspring.
Gorgo also inspired about a year or 2 years worth of comics from Charlton Comics. Charlton was like a distant third or fourth or fifth after DC and Marvel in the early 60s.
Eugene Laurier himself was now firmly typed as a dinosaur wrangler and directed no films after Gorgo, but instead devoted himself to production design and special effects, often on a grand scale. His most notable later work includes the apocalyptic sci-fi spectacle Crack in the World, the all-star World War II epic Battle of the Bulge, and the disastrous but Oscar-nominated Krakatoa East of Java.
And was the art director on both The Naked Kiss and Shock Corridor, which has some of the wildest imagery of any Sam Fuller movie, which is saying something.
Today, over 50 years since its debut, Gorgo remains a monster movie for kids of all ages. Many claimants to the title Ninth Wonder of the World have followed King Kong's Eighth Wonder lead, but in terms of enduring impact, Eugene Laurier's Gorgo may still lead the parade. You just asked Mr. Dorkins. Tickets, anyone?